They were opposites in every way. He, a millionaire with a cold heart, she, a waitress accustomed to fighting for the basics. The contract that brought them together was meant to be nothing more than an impersonal transaction, but the birth of two small lives would transform lies and past traumas into a story of love and redemption. Matt McAllister was a man who had everything money could buy, yet he seemed to live like a shadow within his own mansion in Chicago. Surrounded by an oppressive silence, his days were filled with paperwork, meetings, and trials, but nothing could fill the emptiness in his chest. Deep down, he knew his life of luxury could never erase the weight of a past riddled with twists and lies. Admired by many, the sparkle in his eyes that people expected to find was nothing more than a well-rehearsed facade. It was easy for outsiders to think Matt led a perfect life, but the price of his fortune had been higher than he was willing to admit. Loneliness was his most faithful companion, and he had grown accustomed to avoiding any emotional connections that might threaten his protective walls. Each night, as he stared out the window of his office at the city that never slept, he felt something was deeply wrong. Being a millionaire brought him comfort, but it never brought meaning. Within that mansion, which more closely resembled a mausoleum of luxury, Matt hid secrets he didn't dare confront. Work, though exhausting, was the only thing that kept him moving. He preferred diving into the intricacies of a complicated case to facing the echo of his own doubts. And even though the walls were adorned with priceless works of art, the mansion felt cold, devoid of any sense of home. Something was missing, and he knew that if he didn't find it soon, he might lose himself completely. While his colleagues spoke of families, vacations, and personal achievements, Matt remained distant, responding with an empty, polite smile. He justified his emotional absence as a small price to pay for success, but deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. Every time he saw a family on the street, a part of his armor seemed to crack. Could that be what he was missing? An heir to fill the void that no amount of money could erase? Days dragged on in a meticulously controlled routine, but Matt began to notice small signs of wear. It was as if his mind was teasing him, insisting on questions he didn't want to answer. The idea of a child started to appear as a constant whisper, a pragmatic solution to an emotional problem. He didn't want love, he wanted continuity. A legacy that didn't require feelings, just a clear and objective contract. Could that even be possible? Deep down, Matt knew that pursuing this solution meant more than just wanting an heir. It was a desperate attempt to find something he couldn't name. But how could he give love to another life when he didn't know how to receive it himself? Sleepless nights were filled with conflicting thoughts. No matter how cold and pragmatic he was, the emptiness was becoming impossible to ignore. And for the first time in years, he considered doing something outside his meticulous control. Determined to act, Matt began searching for a practical solution to his newfound obsession. He didn't want a relationship, much less to become involved with someone who could threaten his emotional independence. He needed someone as broken as he was, someone who would see an opportunity in his proposal, not a problem. And so, he began planning the search for someone willing to accept an unusual agreement. As he meticulously outlined how to make his idea viable, Matt felt a thread of hope, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Perhaps this plan was the solution to his restlessness. However, something inside whispered that the journey would be more complex than he imagined. Could he find someone willing to accept such a peculiar offer? And if he did, what would it truly mean for his life? Matt's story was about to take an unexpected turn. While he believed he was in control, fate had other plans. The pieces were moving, and he had no idea that his search for a practical solution would lead to a direct confrontation with everything he feared facing. The past, the lies, and the emotions locked away were lurking, ready to change his life forever. He didn't know it yet, but the answer to his restlessness was closer than he imagined. In a small, rundown bar on the outskirts of Chicago, a waitress named Eliza was about to be drawn into this tale of twists and turns. And deep in their opposite souls, both were about to discover that not every contract can be signed with a pen, and that money can open doors but never heal wounds. Matt wasn't a man to wait. Determined to find someone who would agree to his proposal, he spent days planning what seemed like the perfect arrangement. No emotions, no complications. One cold night, as he entered a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, his eyes landed on Eliza. She was wiping down a table, her gaze distant, as though life had drained her of every illusion. Something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was her resilience, or maybe the resounding silence they both seemed to share. Eliza wasn't the type of woman to be intimidated by stares. She was used to surviving, and survival left no room for weakness. When Matt approached her with his proposal, the shock in her eyes was undeniable. A man in a suit talking about contracts and money while she balanced a tray? It felt like a cruel joke. But as he began to outline the details, a comfortable place to live, financial security, something inside her chest tightened. It was everything she had ever wanted, but coming from a stranger? Matt knew convincing her wouldn't be easy, but he was skilled with words. He described the arrangement as a mutual investment, a benefit for them both. As she listened, her mind raced. She was drowning in debt, working in a bar that barely paid her rent. The proposal seemed absurd, yet it was undeniably tempting. Still, she hesitated. Accepting would mean abandoning the last shreds of pride she had left. How could she trust a man she barely knew, a millionaire with eyes as cold as the night outside? No matter how pragmatic Matt was, he realized something unsettling. Eliza wasn't like the people he dealt with daily. She challenged him without saying a word, just with that firm gaze that seemed to pierce through him. He had expected to find someone willing to accept his offer without question, but here she was, questioning his intentions with a courage he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he felt a slight discomfort. And yet, he knew she was the right person. Eliza, on the other hand, wrestled with her own doubts. This was a chance to escape a life of struggle, but at what cost? The money Matt offered could change everything, but it seemed to carry an invisible price. That night, as she walked back to her small, freezing apartment, she couldn't shake the proposal from her mind. Something about the way he spoke made her think that behind his rigid exterior, there was more than he was willing to reveal. The next day, Matt returned to the bar. He wasn't a man who usually insisted, but something about Eliza intrigued him. Perhaps it was the way she didn't seem dazzled by the money, or perhaps it was the fact that, for the first time, he didn't feel entirely in control. He made a point of emphasizing the benefits of the deal, making it clear that he expected nothing more than the terms outlined in the contract. But Eliza wasn't easy to convince. "Why me?" she asked, looking him straight in the eye. He didn't have a clear answer. The truth was, Matt was confused too. He didn't know exactly what drew him to this waitress. Perhaps it was her quiet courage, or perhaps it was the fact that she seemed as lost as he was. As they parted ways that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, doubt. And it disturbed him. He needed her to agree. Not just for the plan, but because, in some way, he felt that she was the person who could fill the void he couldn't name. Eliza, however, began to seriously consider the proposal. The mounting bills, the constant sense of failure, the lack of prospects, all weighed heavily on her decision. She knew that accepting meant giving up her freedom, but it also meant a chance to start over. For days, she replayed Matt's every word in her head, trying to find something to justify her hesitation. The truth was, she was afraid. Afraid to trust, afraid to be used, afraid to lose herself in the process. Finally, Eliza made a decision. Before agreeing, she wanted to make something clear. They met again at the bar, and this time she was direct. "I'm not someone who can be bought," she said firmly. Matt expected nothing less from her, but those words made him question his own proposal. Why did this seem more complicated than he had anticipated? She reminded him that he wasn't just negotiating a contract, he was dealing with a person. A person who, like him, carried scars. The two of them stood on the edge of something far greater than they could comprehend. The agreement seemed like just a detail, an excuse for their worlds to collide. While Matt thought he was in control, Eliza showed him that he had no idea what was coming. The adventure they were about to embark on had little to do with money or contracts. It was about discovering what it truly meant to live. Eliza didn't sleep that night. Matt's proposal echoed in her mind like a distant but persistent drumbeat. It was a way out of her financial struggles, a chance to escape the daily battle that seemed to suffocate her. Yet, at the same time, it felt wrong, almost surreal. She didn't trust him. How could she trust someone who could throw around so much money to solve a problem that, for her, was a matter of survival? Something inside her screamed to say no, but another quieter part made her hesitate. As she cleaned the bar the next day, Eliza reflected on her situation. Life had always been hard on her. Abandoned by her family at 17, she had spent the past decade surviving on temporary jobs, sleeping in cramped rooms, and counting every penny. Matt had said he expected nothing beyond a contract, but she knew that nothing in life was ever that simple. A contract? With a millionaire? There has to be more to it, she thought, trying not to let hope take over. She knew hope could be dangerous. Matt, on the other hand, began to feel something he hadn't expected: anxiety. He was a man used to planning every detail, ensuring everything worked as expected. But Eliza was unpredictable. He didn't understand why he cared so much about her decision. It was just an agreement, or so he told himself. Yet, every time she hesitated, he felt a pang of doubt. Perhaps, behind his cold and calculated proposal, he was hoping for more than he was willing to admit. When Eliza finally found the courage to speak, she was direct. "I'm not your puppet, Matt. I'm not for sale." Her words echoed in the uncomfortable silence between them. Matt, surprised by his own reaction, didn't try to persuade her immediately. He simply looked at her, trying to decipher the strength that seemed to challenge him at every turn. For the first time, he realized that money, which had always solved everything, wasn't enough. This waitress wasn't like the others he dealt with. She didn't just want to survive, she wanted dignity. Even with the proposal hanging over her like an easy solution, Eliza couldn't ignore the weight in her chest. She knew what it meant to be used, to be discarded. And as tempting as Matt's money was, the idea of submitting to such a cold arrangement made her want to scream. Yet there was something about him, something she couldn't explain. Behind that calculating gaze, she sensed a void that mirrored her own. And that confused her. Matt wasn't a man accustomed to being challenged. Eliza's refusal unsettled him in a way he couldn't understand. He had always known his proposal was unconventional, but he hadn't expected it to make him question his own intentions. Why did her hesitation affect him so much? He tried not to care, but with each encounter he realized he was dealing with something that went beyond a simple contract. Something inside him was beginning to change, though he didn't want to admit it. Eliza spent days weighing the pros and cons. She wanted to trust Matt, but she didn't know how. Life had never given her reasons to believe in anyone's good intentions. Still, she couldn't forget the tone in his voice when he spoke about the agreement. There was something more there, something he wasn't saying but that seemed to scream in silence. He's lost too, she thought, almost unwillingly. That didn't make things easier, just more complicated. When she finally decided to respond, Eliza was nervous but determined. "I need guarantees," she told Matt, crossing her arms as if trying to protect the little she had left. He in turn accepted the challenge. He wasn't a man who begged, but something made him agree to her terms without hesitation. "You'll have everything in writing, Eliza." "It's just an agreement," he replied, though he knew that nothing about this felt simple. There was a tension between them that both pretended not to notice. Despite the doubts and fears, Eliza began to seriously consider the proposal. It was terrifying, but it was also an opportunity she would never have otherwise. Matt, on the other hand, continued trying to hide from himself what it truly meant. As the two of them danced around the decision, something invisible was binding them together. It wasn't the money or the contract. It was the feeling that, perhaps, they were on the brink of changing their lives in ways neither could predict. They were at a point of no return. Eliza's refusal wasn't final, but it made it clear she wouldn't be easily convinced. For Matt, every moment with her was a lesson in something he still couldn't name. For Eliza, every word he spoke was a reminder that even amid life's lies and twists, there were decisions that could change everything. The next step would be decisive, and both felt they were about to cross a line they could never undo. Eliza hesitated as she stepped into the mansion for the first time. It was immense, silent, almost oppressive, as if it reflected Matt's personality in every corner. She felt out of place, like a piece that didn't belong in this puzzle of luxury and sophistication. Yet, at the same time, there was an air of opportunity in that space. Eliza didn't know how, but she sensed that her presence there was about more than just fulfilling a contract. Perhaps it was a chance to rediscover herself, or to discover who Matt truly was. Matt, on the other hand, observed Eliza with curiosity. He hadn't expected a waitress to have such an impact on his controlled life. Seeing her expression, a mixture of fascination and discomfort, he realized he would need to find a way to build trust. It wasn't something he knew how to do, but somehow, Eliza's quiet strength challenged him. Even though he didn't want to admit it, he knew she had something to teach him, something money could never buy. Living together brought small moments of revelation. Eliza, with her raw honesty, began confronting Matt in ways no one ever dared. "Do you really think you can buy everything?" she asked one evening, staring directly at him. He tried to respond with his typical coldness, but the words didn't come with the same certainty as before. Every conversation with Eliza was a battle of ideas, and without realizing it, he was learning more from her than from any contract or case he had ever faced. Meanwhile, Eliza began to notice that behind Matt's impeccable facade lay deep scars. He didn't speak about his past, but small gestures and glances betrayed the pain he tried to hide. When she mentioned her own struggles to survive, something changed in his expression. It was as if, for a brief moment, he saw a reflection of himself. These rare moments of vulnerability started to create a bond between them, something neither of them knew how to name. Matt, who had always believed in logic above all else, began to recognize the power of emotions. Eliza, with her resilience and candor, made him question his beliefs. "You don't have to be so hard on yourself, you know," she said one evening, almost casually. The comment hit him like a lightning bolt. No one had ever told him that before. He didn't know how to respond, but deep down, he felt those words carried a truth he had always tried to ignore. On the other hand, Eliza was also changing. Living with Matt gave her a different perspective on her own life. He wasn't just a cold, calculating man. He was someone as lost as she was. As he encouraged her to think about her talents and possibilities, she began to see that maybe she wasn't as incapable as she had always believed. For the first time, Eliza started to consider the possibility that her life could be about more than just surviving. Small gestures began to break down the barriers between them. Matt, who had never been one for words, showed his concern through simple actions, like asking if she was comfortable or leaving a book in the living room he thought might interest her. Eliza, in turn, responded with small smiles and remarks that broke the silence. These moments, subtle as they were, marked the beginning of something greater, a connection they both feared but couldn't avoid. Over the days, they began to learn from each other in unexpected ways. Eliza taught Matt to value small moments, while he encouraged her to dream bigger. It was a delicate but essential balance. Every glance exchanged, every seemingly trivial conversation, built something they both knew was important but couldn't fully understand yet. They were beginning to change, together, though neither realized the full extent of it. The mansion, once just a cold and empty structure, began to transform into a place of mutual growth. Matt and Eliza, each in their own way, were challenging their limitations. He learned to listen, and she learned to trust, albeit cautiously. Their journey was just beginning, but it was already clear that both were stepping out of their comfort zones. Something bigger was at play, something far beyond the contract that had brought them together. Though neither of them was ready to admit it, they were starting to rely on each other in ways they couldn't predict. What had begun as a cold transaction was turning into something profoundly human. The pieces of their story were beginning to fall into place, but the greatest challenge was yet to come. Matt and Eliza didn't know it yet, but they were heading toward a confrontation with their own truths and the choices that would define both their futures. Eliza never thought that walking through the gates of that mansion would mark the beginning of something so challenging. The moment she stepped through the grand entrance, carrying her simple luggage and a heavy heart, she felt the weight of what she was stepping into. It wasn't just about the contract, it was about entering a world that wasn't hers, full of luxuries that, rather than fascinating her, seemed to suffocate her. She wanted to believe she was ready for what lay ahead, but deep down, she knew she had no idea what to expect. Matt watched everything from a distance. He had a peculiar way of being present without truly being there. His presence was defined by silences and calculated glances, yet there was something in his posture that betrayed unease. He thought he had everything under control, but Eliza, with her quiet courage, seemed to be the exception to his rules. She brought a different energy to the house, something that made him question whether he truly knew what he was getting himself into. The first days were marked by tension. Eliza felt like she was walking on a minefield, carefully calculating each step to avoid breaking the invisible rules of their cohabitation. Matt, on the other hand, remained focused on the details of the contract, as if that alone could mask the complexity of the situation. Yet, despite themselves, they both began to notice small changes. A kind gesture here, a timid smile there. It was as if something was beginning to shift, slowly but steadily. For Eliza, crossing that threshold wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Being in that house meant facing her own fears and insecurities. She didn't know how to trust Matt, but slowly she began to realize that he didn't know how to trust her, or anyone either. They were navigating uncharted territory, each carrying their own traumas and doubts. And yet, there was an inexplicable sense that they were exactly where they needed to be. Matt, in turn, began to notice details about Eliza that surprised him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her resilience, her honesty, even the way she confronted him without fear, all of it intrigued him. He knew he had made the proposal for practical reasons, but now he was starting to wonder if there was something more. He didn't want to admit it, but her presence was affecting him in ways that made him uncomfortable. Their conversations were short at first, almost transactional. But over time, they began to gain depth. Eliza, always skeptical, started asking questions Matt wasn't prepared to answer. "Why are you like this?" she asked one night, her curiosity disarming. He tried to laugh it off, to deflect, but he realized she wouldn't be fooled so easily. For the first time in years, someone was challenging him to be honest with himself. Living together brought unexpected challenges. Eliza, who had always prided herself on her independence, began to realize how hard it was to accept help. Matt, who had always believed in logic and control, started to understand that not everything could be resolved with a contract. Each of them was learning something new, not because they wanted to, but because the situation forced them to. It was uncomfortable, but it was also transformative. The mansion, once a space of coldness and isolation, began to come alive. Small gestures from Eliza, like rearranging flowers or opening the windows to let in light, brought a sense of humanity to the place. Matt, who had always ignored such things, began to notice. He didn't say anything, but his glances changed. There was something almost imperceptible in the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing something he had never noticed before. Eliza also began to change. She still carried her doubts and fears, but she gradually started to feel more at ease. Not with the luxury, but with the idea that perhaps she had something to offer in that place. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she felt she was contributing in some way. It was new for her and it was terrifying. But at the same time, it was a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Both of them knew the contract was just the beginning. The real challenge wasn't in the signed papers but in what it represented for each of them. Eliza and Matt were stepping into uncharted territory where their emotional barriers would be tested. It was the start of something neither of them could predict, but both felt in some way that their lives would never be the same again. The days at the mansion began to unfold like chapters in a book Eliza never imagined herself starring in. The routine, which at first seemed clear and predictable, soon revealed itself to be full of nuances and challenges. Matt, with his calculated and cold demeanor, was a constant enigma. Though they shared the same space, every conversation felt like a silent battle, a test of patience and willpower. Eliza realized that despite all the money and the twists that had brought him here, he was as trapped by his own barriers as she was. Eliza began to find unexpected allies in this seemingly hostile environment. Margot, the mansion's housekeeper, was one such figure. A soft-spoken woman with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, Margot quickly grew fond of Eliza, recognizing a strength in her that few people in Matt's sheltered world displayed. "You might think he's got it all under control, But no one really knows what he's hiding in here, Margot once said, pointing to her heart. Those words echoed in Eliza, planting the seed of an empathy she hadn't expected to feel. While Eliza discovered allies, she also began to recognize her enemies, and often, they were within herself. The distrust she carried like a shield was one of her biggest obstacles. She wanted to believe Matt could be more than the pragmatic man who had signed that contract, but how could she trust someone so seemingly averse to feelings? Her own fears and insecurities threatened to suffocate any chance of connection. Every kind gesture from Matt was met with caution, as if she were waiting for a hidden trap. Matt, meanwhile, was facing his own trials. Eliza's presence was a constant reminder of everything he had avoided for years: connection, vulnerability, truth. He tried to cling to the professionalism of the contract, but every conversation with Eliza, every glance heavy with meaning, caused his defenses to crack a little more. He could feel himself changing, but he didn't know how to handle it. And that terrified him. The conflicts weren't only internal. Some of Matt's few friends and colleagues began to question his decision to bring Eliza into the mansion. "Is this really safe?" a business partner asked during a dinner. Though Matt tried to downplay the situation, the discomfort was evident. He knew his choice was unconventional, but he was beginning to realize it wasn't just a practical decision. There was something more. Something he couldn't yet name, but that was growing despite his efforts to ignore it. Eliza, on the other hand, began to see that her greatest trial was accepting the possibility that she deserved to be there. For years, she had carried the weight of rejection and abandonment. Matt's proposal had initially seemed like a practical solution to her financial problems, but now she was starting to wonder if there was something more. Margot, ever wise, encouraged her. "You have more to offer than you think, dear. And maybe he needs that more than you realize." Those words fueled a flicker of hope that Eliza wasn't sure she should let grow. The two began to grow closer in unexpected ways. One evening, during a power outage, they were forced to share a conversation by candlelight. Without the distractions of work or luxury, Matt and Eliza spoke about their childhoods, their fears, and their regrets. It was a rare moment of vulnerability where their walls began to crumble, even if just briefly. But, as always, the tension soon returned, a reminder that they were still navigating uncharted waters. The contract, which had initially seemed like such a simple solution, now served as a constant reminder of what had brought them together and, at the same time, what kept them apart. Matt avoided talking about it, while Eliza felt as though her life was being defined by something that increasingly felt inadequate. Both knew they needed to confront this issue, but the fear of ruining what they were building held them back from taking the next step. The trials were only beginning. Though Matt and Eliza were growing closer, they still carried the ghosts of their pasts and the weight of their insecurities. But amid the moments of conflict and small gestures of connection, something greater was taking shape. Something no contract could define, but that both were beginning to feel. They didn't know it yet, but the hidden cave of their fears and hopes was drawing closer, ready to reveal truths that would change everything. The silence of the mansion at dawn had changed. It was no longer the empty kind of silence Eliza had felt during those first nights. Now, it carried the weight of something unspoken, emotions growing between the walls. Everything had shifted with the arrival of the twins. Two small lives had entered their world, bringing chaos and beauty in equal measure. As Eliza recovered and gazed at the two tiny beings who now depended on her, she felt torn. It was impossible to ignore the connection forming, not just with the girls, but also with Matt. Matt, for his part, was captivated, though he would never admit it. When he held the twins for the first time, his hands were steady, but inside, he was trembling. The scene was a shock of reality he hadn't anticipated. The girls had Eliza's eyes, yet there was something about them that was undeniably his, something that bound him in a way he didn't understand. For the first time, he felt vulnerable in a way no amount of money could shield him from. It was terrifying and, at the same time, intoxicating. The days following the birth were intense. Eliza, exhausted, discovered that being a mother was as challenging as it was rewarding. Every cry from the twins tested her resilience, and every smile from them was a silent victory. Matt, on the other hand, seemed lost, as though unsure of what his role was. He tried to be present, but his insecurities held him back. Even so, there were moments when Eliza caught him gazing at the girls with a glimmer in his eyes she had never seen before. The daily routine forced them both to confront truths they had avoided. Watching Matt with the twins, Eliza began to realize he wasn't the cold man she had imagined. In some ways, he was as fragile as the little girls who now occupied the center of their lives. Conversely, Matt saw in Eliza a strength that challenged him to be better. She wasn't just a mother, she was someone who faced her fears and still found room to love, something he had always been afraid of. Over time, the walls between them began to crumble. Matt started to help more, albeit awkwardly. One night, as Eliza struggled to soothe one of the twins, he appeared with a determined look. "Let me," he said, taking the baby into his arms. Eliza was surprised but didn't argue. For the first time, she felt she wasn't alone in this journey. It was a small gesture, but to her, it meant everything. And though Matt didn't say it, it meant the same to him. Yet not everything was easy. The contract remained a shadow between them, a reminder of how it all began. Eliza knew things were changing, but she couldn't forget that there was still a formal agreement defining their lives. Matt, for his part, avoided the topic at all costs. He knew he was becoming attached to something deeper, but he feared admitting it. It was as though acknowledging his feelings would mean losing the control he held so dear. The tension between what they felt and what they avoided saying was palpable. Each day seemed to bring them closer to a breaking point. They shared moments that felt natural, almost familial, yet there was always an invisible wall preventing them from fully letting go. The twins, unknowingly, were at the center of this dilemma, binding them together while also forcing them to confront their own truths. Eliza began to wonder if she should address the issue. Part of her wanted to believe that Matt was changing, but another part remained afraid. She feared that by opening her heart, she would be rejected again. After all, no matter how much he showed signs of transformation, it was still hard for her to trust completely. But there was something inside her that didn't want to give up. Something telling her that, perhaps, it was worth trying. Matt also felt the weight of the moment. He knew he was approaching a crucial decision, but he didn't know how to handle it. He had built his life around control, yet Eliza and the twins were unraveling every layer of his defenses. He needed to confront what he felt, but he feared what he might lose in the process. And deep down, he knew the contract was merely an excuse to avoid facing the truth. The birth of the twins hadn't just brought life to the mansion, it had also brought the need for change. Matt and Eliza were being pulled into the hidden cave of their deepest emotions and fears. It was a path neither of them wanted to walk, yet it was becoming inevitable. The question now was, would they be ready to face what they found within? It was late at night when Matt walked into the study, the contract in his hands. That piece of paper, which months ago had seemed like the solution to all his problems, now weighed on him like a chain around his neck. The words written on it stared back at him, a stark reminder of the man he once was: cold, calculating, incapable of letting anything slip beyond his control. He knew he needed to decide what it meant now. Could he continue pretending that documents still held any power over his life? Eliza, meanwhile, had no idea of the storm raging in Matt's mind. For her, life had become a mix of exhaustion and joy. The twins were her priority, but in moments of quiet, she found herself thinking about Matt. He had changed so much, yet he still seemed to be fighting something invisible. She wanted to believe he saw her as more than just a part of the contract, but she was afraid of fooling herself. After all, the contract was the foundation of everything, and she didn't know if he'd be willing to tear that foundation apart. The confrontation happened unexpectedly. That same night, Matt found her in the living room, cradling one of the twins. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there, a weight she couldn't quite identify. He sat down beside her, the contract still in his hands, and remained silent for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, almost fragile. "Eliza, I made a mistake. I thought I could fix everything with an agreement, but I didn't understand what this would come to mean." Eliza's heart raced. Matt's words were unlike anything she had expected to hear. He continued, looking at the contract as though it physically hurt him. I was so lost, so obsessed with controlling everything, that I forgot life doesn't work that way. This contract, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. What matters is you and the girls." And then, to her astonishment, he tore the contract into pieces and let them fall to the floor. The moment was heavy with emotion. Eliza didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe this was real, that Matt was truly changing, but another part of her was still afraid. Yet, something in his eyes convinced her. He wasn't lying. For the first time, she saw the man behind the facade, vulnerable, scared, but also willing to face his own mistakes. It disarmed her in ways she hadn't expected. After tearing up the contract, Matt spoke about things he had never shared with anyone. He told Eliza about his past, the lies that had shaped him, and the emptiness that had followed him for so long. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he just wanted her to know. Eliza listened in silence, taking in every word. When he finished, she finally responded. "I'm scared too, Matt. Scared to trust, to believe this could be real. I want to try." It was in that moment that their relationship fundamentally changed. The contract, which had once been a symbol of control, was now just a reminder of how far they had come. They knew there was still much to face, but for the first time, they felt they were in this together. The twins, as if sensing the significance of the moment, slept peacefully, oblivious to the emotional storm their parents were navigating. Matt realized that this moment wasn't just about tearing up a contract. It was about accepting love, connection, and vulnerability. It was about admitting that he needed Eliza as much as she needed him. And as terrifying as it was, he was willing to face whatever came next. Eliza, in turn, felt something inside her begin to settle. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the future could be different. But the journey was far from over. Tearing up the contract was only the first step. Now, they had to build something real, something that didn't depend on words written on a piece of paper. Matt and Eliza stood on the brink of a new chapter, and they both knew it would be challenging. Yet, for the first time, they were ready to face those challenges together. The days following the breaking of the contract felt like a fresh start for Matt and Eliza. It was no longer just about the twins or the agreement that had brought them together. For the first time, they were building something genuine, without the shadow of predefined obligations. Eliza, who had once viewed the mansion as a prison disguised as luxury, began to see it as a place where real memories could be made. The twins were living proof of this, filling the halls with laughter and life. Matt felt like a man reborn. He had never imagined that letting go of control could bring so much freedom. The walls he had built around himself over the years were coming down, one by one. Every moment with Eliza and the girls was a lesson that life didn't have to be so methodical, so calculated. He was beginning to understand that what truly mattered wasn't money or legacy, but the connections he was finally learning to value. Eliza was changing too. The weight of distrust she had carried for so long was beginning to lift. Matt was no longer just the man who had proposed a contract. He was someone she saw trying, day by day, to be better. Watching his efforts to be present as a father and partner moved her in ways she couldn't describe. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream of a future that wasn't just about survival but about building something meaningful. It was the small gestures that meant the most. Matt learned how to change diapers, albeit clumsily, while Eliza laughed at his frustrated attempts. They bonded over simple moments, like walking together in the garden while the twins slept, or sharing stories from their pasts that they had once avoided. The mansion, once cold and distant, was transforming into a home. Every laugh, every conversation, every exchanged glance was a brick in the foundation of something greater. Margot, ever observant, noticed the changes and smiled with approval. "You're finally starting to understand what really matters," she said one evening as she prepared dinner. Matt, who once viewed such words as intrusions, now welcomed them as reminders that he was on the right path. He knew he still had much to learn, but he also knew he was surrounded by the people who would help him grow. The twins, without even realizing it, were the strongest bond between Matt and Eliza. Every smile, every sound they made, was a reminder that their lives were now forever connected. Matt, who had always feared attachment, could no longer imagine his life without those two little presences. Eliza, in turn, felt that her daughters had given her something she had never had before, a family. And with that, the strength to believe she could overcome anything. Despite their progress, the fears didn't entirely disappear. Matt still struggled with the idea that he didn't know how to be a good father or partner, while Eliza feared that this was all temporary, a dream that could collapse. But instead of letting those fears drive them apart, they began to face them together. It was a slow process, full of ups and downs, but they both knew it was worth it. What once seemed impossible was becoming a reality. Matt and Eliza, two strangers brought together by such practical reasons, now found in each other a reason to believe in love, family, and the possibility of change. They weren't perfect, but they were learning to accept their imperfections and work together to build something greater. And in the midst of it all, they found a strength they never imagined they possessed. As the twins grew, Matt and Eliza grew with them. Each day brought new challenges but also new rewards. They learned that life didn't need to be controlled to be lived. Sometimes, the most unexpected twists brought the best moments. The mansion, now full of laughter and chaos, stood as a testament to that. And though there was still much to be done, they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Together, they realized that the true reward wasn't something that could be measured in money or contracts. It was the love, the connection, the family they were building. Matt and Eliza, with their differences and similarities, found in each other what they had never sought but had always needed. And above all, they discovered that life, as unpredictable as it might be, could be extraordinary when lived with an open heart. The routine in the mansion developed a rhythm of its own, no longer dictated by contracts or imposed rules. Now, it was the organized chaos of a growing family. The twins filled Matt and Eliza's days with laughter, cries, and constant lessons. The nights, once cold and lonely, were now filled with conversations and shared moments of reflection. But as with any journey of transformation, the road back to normal life wouldn't be easy or linear. Matt began to feel the weight of what it truly meant to open himself to the unknown. He had torn up the contract, but there were still parts of himself resisting this new dynamic. Control, the shield he had always relied on, continued to resurface. Small arguments arose between him and Eliza, not from a lack of love, but because both were still learning how to genuinely share their lives. He realized that change wasn't a single moment but a constant process. Eliza, in turn, faced her own challenges. Her past still haunted her in unexpected moments. There were days she doubted herself, questioning if she truly deserved this new life. But then she would look at the twins, and at Matt, who was trying despite his mistakes, and feel that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This was the life she had always dreamed of, even if it had come about in ways she could never have predicted. The relationship between Matt and Eliza continued to evolve. Without the contract looming over them, they were learning to truly know one another. Small moments, like laughing together while attempting to cook or sharing childhood stories, became the foundation of a deeper connection. Yet amid these moments, the challenge of navigating their differences persisted. They were discovering that loving someone didn't mean agreeing on everything. It meant choosing to stay, even when things got difficult. A turning point came during a business meeting Matt insisted on hosting at the mansion. For him, it was an attempt to return to familiar ground, to reclaim part of his old identity. But when one of the guests made a disparaging comment about Eliza, insinuating that she was merely a phase in Matt's life, he reacted in an unexpected way. "Eliza is my family," he said, his voice firm. The declaration surprised even him, but it was the moment he realized there was no turning back. She was a part of him now, and he was willing to fight for that. Eliza, who overheard the conversation from a distance, felt a mix of emotions, touched by Matt's words but also apprehensive. While his statement was comforting, she knew there was still much work to be done. They had much to learn about being a family, about supporting each other without letting the fears of their pasts sabotage them. But in that moment, she decided it was worth trying. Not for the money or the security, but because she believed in them. Life began to take on a new stability. The twins were growing quickly, and every milestone, their first smiles, their first words, was celebrated as a collective victory. Matt, who once feared he wouldn't know how to be a father, now found himself fully engaged. He read to them at night, carried them on his shoulders during walks in the garden, and above all, was present. Eliza watched with admiration, seeing him become the man she had always believed he could be. But the road back also brought external challenges. The world didn't pause to let Matt and Eliza build their new life. Criticism, judgments, and doubts still surfaced from people who didn't understand what had brought them together. Yet with every obstacle, they found ways to grow stronger. Together, they learned that the best way to face the world was as a team, supporting one another even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and coldness, was now a home. Every corner of the house reflected the life they were building. Toys scattered on the floor, family photos on the walls, and laughter echoing through the halls. For Matt and Eliza, the journey back wasn't about returning to who they had been before but about discovering a new version of themselves. A version that embraced love, vulnerability, and, above all, hope. They still had a long road ahead, but that no longer frightened them. The twins were their center, but they also began to see that they were building something even greater, a life that wasn't perfect but was authentic. And as they walked this path together, they discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to keep trying day after day. Matt never imagined he would find himself where he was now, sitting on the living room floor, one twin asleep in his lap and the other playing with a doll beside him. The mansion, once so imposing and empty, now felt smaller, almost welcoming. The silence that had once been his escape was now filled with sounds that brought life. Every laugh, every noise from the girls, was a reminder that he had changed, and was still changing. But there was still something within him that needed to be confronted. Matt's past was a shadow he had avoided for years, but over the past months with Eliza and the girls, he began to realize he could no longer run from it. He knew he couldn't be the father and partner he wanted to be while carrying that emotional baggage. On a quiet night, he asked Eliza to sit down with him. For the first time, he would talk about the lies that had shaped his life, the traumas that had made him the cold man she first met. It was a moment of courage but also of vulnerability. Eliza listened patiently. Matt spoke about a childhood marked by rejection, about the pressure to be perfect in a world that only valued results. He confessed that money had become his armor, a way to protect himself from the world and from his own fears. Every word lifted a weight from his chest, and by the time he finished, he felt exhausted but also relieved. Without hesitation, Eliza took his hand. "You don't have to be perfect, Matt. You just need to be here, present." That moment was a turning point for Matt. He realized his greatest battle wasn't with the world but with his own beliefs. He had spent so much time building an image of strength and control that he hadn't seen the real strength in admitting his weaknesses. His resurrection wasn't a grand, dramatic event. It was a series of small, daily gestures, being present for the girls, apologizing when he made mistakes, allowing himself to laugh and love without fear. Eliza, too, was experiencing her own resurrection. Living with Matt and the twins brought her own fears and traumas to the surface. But seeing Matt open up made her feel that she could let down her defenses as well. For the first time, she didn't have to be the strong woman who faced everything alone. She could be vulnerable, she could trust. Together, they were learning that love wasn't about being perfect, but about being willing to grow and change. The twins, unknowingly, were at the center of this transformation. Every moment with them was a lesson that life was about more than contracts or the past. They brought Matt and Eliza something they had both lost over the years: hope. Simply watching the girls discover the world, hearing their laughter, was enough to remind them that they were on the right path, even if challenges still lay ahead. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, but now they faced it all together. Matt, who had once lived for control, now lived to enjoy the moment. Eliza, who had once feared trusting, now allowed herself to believe. Their resurrection was ongoing, a process that required effort and patience, but one that was profoundly rewarding. The changes in the mansion were more than physical, they were emotional. The place that had once symbolized isolation was now a home. Matt and Eliza, with their differences and similarities, had created a space where they could be themselves. And each day, they grew closer, Not just as parents but as partners who had learned to accept one another. The resurrection of Matt and Eliza wasn't just about them, it was about what they were building together. It was about showing the twins that love was possible, even when it seemed improbable. It was about proving that life's twists and turns, no matter how difficult, could lead to something extraordinary. And as they looked toward the future, they knew they were ready for anything as long as they faced it together. The morning was bright, and the sound of the twins' laughter filled the air as they ran through the mansion's garden. Matt and Eliza watched from a distance, sitting side by side on a bench beneath the shade of a tree. The scene seemed like something out of a dream, but it was their reality. A life they had built with effort, patience, and a great deal of love. For both of them, that moment wasn't just a peaceful interlude. It was a reflection of everything they had overcome and how much they had transformed. Matt had never imagined he would one day say he felt complete. In the past, his life had revolved around goals, contracts, and material achievements, but now he understood that true value lay in the simple moments. He glanced at Eliza, who was smiling as the girls played, and felt something he never thought possible: gratitude. Not for the fortune he had amassed, but for the fact that she had chosen to be part of his life and, together with him, build something so special. Eliza, too, was reflecting on the path that had brought her here. Her life had been marked by challenges, by a constant feeling of inadequacy. But at that moment, as she watched the twins happy and Matt finally at peace with himself, she knew every struggle had been worth it. This was her elixir, the certainty that she had found her place in the world, a place where she was accepted, valued, and, above all, loved. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was truly living. The twins, with their infectious energy, were the center of this new life. For Matt, they represented more than just his legacy. They were living proof that he was capable of love and of being loved. Every milestone, their first steps, their first words, was a triumph he celebrated with joy. For Eliza, they were an extension of everything she had always dreamed of, a family that, despite its imperfections, was real and united. The impact of this transformation extended beyond the mansion's walls. Matt, once so reclusive and focused on work, began using his influence to help others find their own second chances. He started supporting projects that benefited women like Eliza, those who, despite adversity, had the strength to start over. For him, it was a way to honor everything she had taught him and to share the lessons she had brought into his life. Eliza, in turn, found a new passion: helping other women believe in themselves. Inspired by her own journey, she began working on a community project to support single mothers. For her, it was a way to give back and to remind herself every day of where she had come from and how far she had come. Matt supported her every step of the way, captivated by her determination and compassion. Though they were living a life full of achievements, Matt and Eliza never forgot that it all began with a cold, impersonal contract. They often talked about it, laughing at the irony of how something so mechanical had led to something so extraordinary. For them, it was a reminder of life's unpredictability and how the greatest transformations often arise from the most improbable circumstances. The days continued to pass, but the feeling of newness never faded. Every moment together was a gift, every challenge an opportunity to strengthen the bond they had built. The twins were growing up quickly, and with them, the love between Matt and Eliza grew as well. They knew the journey would never be perfect, but they had come to understand that perfection wasn't the goal. What mattered was the commitment to keep trying, to keep choosing each other, day after day. In that garden, as the sun began to set, Matt and Eliza exchanged a look that said everything without the need for words. They had found what they were looking for, even without knowing they had been searching for it. Their elixir wasn't something physical or tangible, it was the life they were living, the family they were building, the love they had learned to share. And with that, they were ready for anything the future might bring.